Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and what I want to talk about today was basically Angular, Vue, and React. So I wrote this article. Basically what I've been doing is that as I learn different technologies, back-end and front-end, I generally create blogs. I just create another, I create blogs. Whether I create a new blog from the back-end or I use an existing back-end, then create a new front-end. And a project I did recently, so this is just kind of a Medium article where I documented this project. I made a blog using several tools. Okay, so here I used 6 tools. Now in a previous video we went over Stencil and Svelte. Okay, Stencil and Svelte, which are compilers. So in the sense that you do all the coding beforehand and then you compile the code into standard web code. Okay, so which is why they oftentimes aren't referred to as a framework because you're compiling. While Angular, Vue, and React, which is what I hope to go over today, they are a framework in the sense that they are a way to structure your JavaScript code. They're a collection of libraries and tools that generally run sort of real time in delivering your application or components for applications. And then Gatsby, which maybe we'll get to in this video, but that's a framework that's built on top of React, giving it even a more sort of structured framework for building, for compiling your website into static pages. Okay, cool. So let's take a look. And basically what I did here is that I have a blog that I created using a Headless CMS, particularly Contentful. And the cool thing about a Headless CMS is that there's no front page. It's just you create your front end using whatever host you like, whatever framework you like, whatever language you like, whatever you want to do, and you just pull in the content from an API call or AJAX call. So essentially, the content, like here's the version in Vue, here's the version in React, here's it in Angular. I didn't create necessarily super fancy, pretty websites. The main thing was just to kind of get used to the workflow of these frameworks, and that's what I hope to get across in this video. Sort of what is the workflow, what are they like, so that way you can get a better idea of what things you may want to learn next. So this is the Angular version, and let me get to the Angular version of that. So, and that should be this one right here. Okay, so basically when you queue up a new Angular project, Angular does have a command line tool, so you would start the project using the command line. You would use it to generate new components, but basically you're gonna end up with a folder kind of like this. Okay, there's your normal Git folder for Git commits. The dist folder is when you actually like build your program for release. That'll end up here. E2E is just for testing, end-to-end testing. We won't worry about that. Your node modules folder where all your node dependencies are. Again, these are all node frameworks, so you'll need node to download them and use their CLI tools. So really all your work is done in this source folder. In the source folder you have your app folder. Okay, here's where all your components are. Okay, we'll come back to that. Your assets is where you could put like images and stuff like that. And then environments, this is just configurations for like development, production, whatnot. Okay. Then there's some other stuff here. There's your index HTML in case you needed to change anything in there. But really at the end of the day, like most single application frameworks, your index HTML really just calls upon a root component, and then everything else is done from your JavaScript. Except, in particular, Angular, kind of like Stencil, if you watch the Stencil Svelte video, uses TypeScript. So notice that all the files, instead of having a JS suffix, have a TS suffix, because it is TypeScript. And you can actually choose to use Sass instead of CSS, or you could configure CSS. When you use a CLI to spin up a new project, it'll ask you how do you want to design your styling. So I did it in CSS because I wanted to get some more practice in Sass. Okay, but basically your main app component is the only one that's not in a folder. So that's right here. And generally you have a couple different files. But the files you really care about are the app.component. So this is the actual component. Okay. And then the app component HTML, which is the template. So when that component is rendered, this is the HTML it renders to the screen. Okay, so unlike Stencil and Svelte, where basically you have the template and the component sort of configuration in the same file. Here they do everything is kind of broken up in separate files. So here I have an HTML file for the template. So this is what renders when that component renders. Here's my CSS file, or SCSS file because it's Sass, where I can do all my styling. And again, Sass, so I'm using like nested styles. And then here's where you would configure your CSS, or you configure your component. So like this is like the selector, so that's where that app root tag comes in. This tells it where the template is in the HTML file, and this tells it where the styling is in the styling file. And then if I want to throw in any data that I can use, I can just put it over here. And then that data would be available to me in the component. And that's it. Okay, so if we go back to my template over here, right there, okay, you notice that I call the router. Okay, so Angular has a built-in router, which that gets configured over here. Okay, so app routing module comes in there, and it comes in your boilerplate and allows you to, so you would import your components that you already made. So you can create a component to use either as like a full page, which is kind of what I did here. So again, I made a page for blogs, and basically here is a path that says, hey, when you go to root/blogs, bring up the component blogs component. Cool, and you can set up all your routes that way. But again, you got to import your components up here, or else it won't know what's going on. So then here in my blogs component is where I did my blogging stuff. Okay, now what I did in this particular page, so if we go back and take a look, so if I click on the blogs page over here, I get this page. So really the AJAX call is just for this post here, grabbing the most recent post from my headless blog. And then here's a list of all my other blogs that I've created so far. And that's what that has. Okay, cool. And then I do the AJAX call in the TypeScript over here. Okay, so here I use the lifecycle function. So when this component initializes, it uses Angular's built-in tool for AJAX requests, pulls in the data from the AJAX request, and stores it in this blogs.data. Cool. Okay, and that's configured through the HTTP service, which Angular's built-in JavaScript HTTP service gets configured in this file over here, HTTP service. So there I configured the URL and all that stuff. So the thing about Angular is that everything's kind of split up in a lot of files. It has a very organized workflow, but it does take a little while to get used to it, and there's just a lot more to learn up front. But the organization actually makes things a lot easier. I also made a footer component, but the footer component isn't routed to. It's actually part of the root component. So if we go back to, or the home page, home component, and notice I put, no, not in there. Maybe it is the root component, which is the app component. Let's go back to the HTML. Yep, so I put the app footer right there. So you see, I put the footer, and that's where I put the footer for the website, and that's all there. Cool. That's pretty much the gist of sort of how an Angular project. Now, Angular has all sorts of tools that are built in, which is one nice thing about Angular. Like you have, like, for example, the AJAX calls was built in, and then you also have like tools for like looping. It also has what's called directives, so you can make it where certain components only show up if certain variables are true. You can make styling conditional, so that's actually what I did here. So see this button right here, change colors. If I click on it, it's actually setting different variables true and false, and changing the style based on which variables are true and false. So just to kind of show that, that should be in the footer component. Okay, here's the button. So you see here, ng class allows me to like make an object of different styles and what variable they're attached to. So this first style will only, well, if the variable first is true, then style 1 will apply. If the variable second is true, then style 2 will run. So you have all these really kind of cool built-in stuff into Angular, more so than many of the other frameworks. But it does mean there's more to learn. Cool, so that's Angular, not so bad. Okay, now let's take a look at React. So this is what I did in React. React is sort of like the #1 framework right now. For good reason. The learning curve is not that bad because it's mostly HTML. So let's go to React. Okay, now here is the blog I did in this version of this blog in React. Basically, when you spin up your new project using the create React app thing, it's like a little command line thing where you can just create a new React project. Just similar, again, you have a public folder. That's where if you run a build, that's where all your files will go into, so you can send it out. Actually, it's in build. Okay. The public folders are actually where is all your public assets. So there's your index.html. And again, like all the other ones, all it does is call a root component. So what it does, it puts in this div, says, hey, the root component should show up here. And that's literally all the index file really does. Then you go to your source folder, and this is where all your components are going to be. But you see, it's not naturally kind of put into any kind of folder structure like it was in Angular, so I don't have a folder for each of my components. And I really only have like 2 files for each component. My CSS file and my JavaScript file. Okay, so it's all done in 2 files. Okay. So if we go to my app.js, really what happens here is I import all the stuff I need from React up here and any other components. And then I can either do a functional component, so basically I define it through a function, or I can do it through a class, which I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But basically what this function does, and then what you do is you return, and in parentheses, you start putting in HTML. So basically you're doing your HTML in your JavaScript file. This is referred to as JSX. Okay? And really the main rules here are there can only be one parent element, so notice how everything is a subchild or child of the div. Okay, there has to only be one parent element. If not, you have to do it in an array. I'm not going to get into that. And a couple of little nuances, like for example, I can't use the word class when defining my styles. If I'm doing JSX, which means I'm not in an HTML file, I'm in a JavaScript file, I have to use class name when I'm defining classes for my HTML tags. It's just the way it works. Okay, but otherwise, it works the same as doing HTML, which makes life real simple. And the cool thing is you can put JavaScript in HTML and put in templates, and we'll come back to that. So basically all I'm doing here is I put this title here. So if we go back to the picture, see there's the title. But then there's all these blog posts. Where do those come from? Well, that comes from this post container component. So let's take a look at that. So this is a class component. So notice here I defined a class, not a function, which allows me to make use of the constructor. Okay, and the constructor allows me to make use of what's called state. So think about it this way. You have variables that exist inside the component, and then there's variables that you'll give the component. Any variable inside the component is called state. And what you have to do is in the constructor, you define this state object, and then you literally put all your variables as an object in this state thing. Okay, but those variables are not being given to the component, you're building them into the component. Then there's props, which I'm not using here, but if you were using props, props would be variables that you would pass down to the component. We'll give you an example of that in a moment. Okay, but essentially why I'm using state is for this post array, because I'm going to store all my blog posts in this array. And the benefit of state and not just naming a variable is that when I notice that any state variable or any props variable changes, the component is going to re-render on the screen. So Angular does this too. This is called data binding, where basically notice as data changes, it changes that part of the website. Not the whole website, just that part of the website. This way you have a faster experience. That's the benefit of these frameworks. But instead of having its own special Ajax call tool, React just uses the normal JavaScript fetch. So here I just use the normal JavaScript fetch API to call in my function. And that's that. Okay, so I call in the function. I store the variables in my state. And again, you don't just do state dot state equals. You have to assign it through a function called setState. So these are just little nuances. And then that's that. Okay, but again, this is not happening. This is happening as a lifecycle function. So this is called component.didMount, which means it happens when the component exists. And down here is my JSX. So really it's just a div, and in this div I have a template. So see these curly brackets? That means I'm putting in like a variable. or I'm using something like JavaScript. So anywhere I put curly brackets, I can like kind of exit the HTML and do like JavaScript. So even though it's in this div HTML tag, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, in here I want you to map using the map array function, which is going to iterate over my array of posts, and I'm going to create this post component, and I'm going to pass to that post component these pieces of data. So that's what props are, properties, kind of like properties in an HTML tag. So if we go to that posts component over here, I did, well, you don't actually have to do anything special to define prompts, especially for like for a component. It's just that any variables I pass down as a props, meaning as a property, I call by using this .props.title, because that's what I called it over here. So see how I said title equals this variable here. So now when I'm in that component, I have access to that variable here. And then again, this and it's this component that's being rendered over and over again to create each of these individual blog posts. So post container is the div that all these posts are stored in, that uses the map function to iterate over the array of posts and creates a post component for each one of these. And that's kind of how I created that. Okay, so that's React, and really, again, for the most part, you're using JavaScript. Now, what happens is a lot of people don't like using these class ones because they're a little bit more complicated to set up. So recently, what they did, they came out with something called React hooks that allows you to kind of do more of the kind of stuff you would do with a class component and a function component. You know, however you like to do it. So that's the basics of the workflow with React. Now, last one let's do is Vue. Okay, here's my Vue version of this. Okay, ignore the pop-ups. That's from my group project as I go through this General Assembly bootcamp. So here I have just another version of the same thing, just again iterating different posts. But let's take a look at the code. So this is Vue. Now when you do Vue and you create and again you're going to use your command line tool in your terminal to say, hey, create a new application, read the docs to see how each one is done. But when you create a new project, very similar. Again, you have a distribution folder. That's going to be where your built code that you can go distribute is. You have your public folder. That's where your index.html is going to be hanging out. And again, it starts off with like a root component. So very similar to React and Angular. Okay, the index file isn't doing too much. Theoretically, you could, you know, include stuff up here if you need to use it. For some reason, sometimes that causes errors. So I usually just do all my CSS by hand. So like before, all your work is going to be done in the source folder where you have assets, where you can put all your photos and images, and components, where all your individual components are at. Okay? Except here, each component has a .vue extension. So here's the app.vue file. And here, it's just one file. So it's not like Angular where it was 3 files, a CSS file, an HTML file, and a TS file. It's not like React where you had a CSS file and a JS file. Here, there's just one file. Because basically in the beginning, you'll have in the template tag is your template. So you put your HTML here. Then in your script tag is where you would do all the JavaScript stuff. So here's where I would configure my component, import what I need to import, define the name of the tag, set up my data, put any functions that I need available. So here I'm using I created this function to go grab my Ajax from that using async await in order to what am I saying? To go make the Ajax call to the headless blog, and then I style it down here between the style tag. So it's all in one file. Okay. And again here, I'm going to import card because I'm going to use this component I made for each card. Each card is each of these little blog posts. It's a card that I created as a component. So in my components folder, I created a card.vue file. Here is the template. It's just a div with a couple tags. Here I configured my component. So basically I said, hey, there's some data that's going to be passed down as an object, because that function from before fetches that data and then iterates and passes down an object with my post data to each card. And then here's the styling of the card. And that's it. You just keep doing that. Now, as far as iterating went, I'm pretty sure here we just used the map again. Let's see here. Where did I iterate? But wait, that window this post, window the console. Okay, that just grabs the AJAX request. Let's go back to the template. Oh, okay. Here we go. So in Vue, it does have its own built-in tool directives, kind of like Angular. So so basically, you have it all in one file. And this is actually a lot like Svelte. Okay, so if you remember, like in the video, Svelte, Stencil was more like a mix of Angular and React, and Svelte is more like this, where everything's in one file. And then Vue has this iterating directive, so v4. So it's just going to repeat this tag for as many posts as they're in post. Okay, then I'm binding the data of post to this card and giving it a key of post ID, because you have to give a key to each individual element, so that way it doesn't freak out. But that's the Vue workflow. Pretty straightforward, and then you just build it, and ta-da! Let's see how much time. Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in Gatsby. Okay, so let's bring up the Gatsby one. Okay, so let's go to the blog post and right-click, open a new tab. Let's take a look at the Gatsby build. Okay, and this actually Gatsby has its own cloud for deploying its own websites, which is nice. Okay, and see, it looks similar. Again, I wasn't trying to design anything super fancy. It was just, and what I did here is that this is just the newest post from the Headless blog. And then this is actually a post from a markdown file. That's the cool thing about Gatsby. You can pull information from anywhere. The way Gatsby works is that while you're using React to design your website on the front end, it has this extra sort of side to it, where basically when you compile it, it pulls from several different information sources, which could be, imagine you're pulling from like Airtable, an Excel spreadsheet, or like spreadsheet on Google Sheets, APIs, pretty much anywhere. So you pull from all these different sources, it collects all the data, and then you can use the data via GraphQL calls. So basically it creates like a little mini database at compile time, and then you access that database using GraphQL, which is a database query language created by Facebook. And then that gives you access to the data to render your pages. So let's show you how that works. It's actually really cool. Okay, so that's over here. So let me just close this out. Okay, so once you create a new Gatsby project, and again, there's a bunch of different Gatsby starters, so you can find a template for any kind of project you're making, which is also really nice about Gatsby. But this is just using the default starter. Just like before, you have a public folder. There's where you'll find your, when everything is built out and you want to distribute it, it's all going to be in there. Here's your source folder with everything you're going to be working on. There's your components. So if you're doing your basically like working in React, every component has a JavaScript file and a CSS file. So this is really no different. So like, for example, this is my post component. So it's just straight up React. So there's my imports. But again, the way you pull in data is what's unique. I'm going to use GraphQL. So here what I'm doing, or actually right here, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to have this data. I'm pulling in data into my component, and I'm going to be querying the information that I'm pulling into Gatsby. And then I'm going to use this as the query. And you'll actually be able to create, there's this tool called GraphQLi that you'll actually be able to do in the browser, so that way you can build your queries. So you're not supposed to magically like, no, this is the right query. What you would do is you would go to this special page while you're running your development server, where you can build out your queries and make sure you're getting the right information, which is really cool. Okay, but then basically anything that this query generates is now available to me, and now I can pull it up. So data.allblogpost.nodes, the blog title, and again, that query tool will let you figure out what the right path to the right data is. Okay, but see, so basically I'm still just using JSX, except now again I'm pulling all the data via GraphQL queries. Now how do I set up all that information? Okay, and again, here's like a markdown file somewhere. Where is that? Where do I have the markdown file? Yeah, I think it's in here. Yeah, here's my markdown file. Okay, and then that's what it's pulling from when it pulls on that first post from a markdown file. So I could actually create a whole bunch of markdown files and iterate over the query will generate an array of markdown files, and I can treat it almost just like a blog. That's a thing you can do. That is really cool. Now in this pages folder, any of these JavaScript files here get treated as a page. So index would be your root, and then you can actually go to like /page2 and it would take you to this file, which again is just another React file, but you don't necessarily need like a special router. It just knows that anything in this pages folder are your pages, and then any components you're making are going to be in this folder. And there's a couple other folders in here, other important files here. Gatsby Config. There's a lot of different like what's called plugins in Gatsby that allow you to bring information from different places. So you want to use an Excel spreadsheet or use a Google Sheet, you find the right plugin and you configure it here. So here's where you can configure, like, this is where basically it tells Gatsby where to grab all the data to build its database. And then Gatsby Node is a tool for you to create new data nodes. So if maybe you're not pulling in data from somewhere through one of the plugins, maybe you want to design your code to create the data you need, here's where you do it. I had to do that to pull it in from make an Ajax request because I couldn't figure out the plugin they had for APIs, so I just manually did it. So you use, you know, a lot of the tools that, so basically what we did here is kind of explain what happens here. Okay, first we got to bring in fetch and query string because again this is all happening not in the browser, so I don't have access to the native browser fetch API. I have to pull it in through Node.js. Okay, really. So basically what's going on here is we're just creating the node. So here I define the function that pulls in the data. So this is just the fetch that iterates the data and creates a node out of it. And again, the nodes are the things you can query in GraphQL. But you would do that in this node folder. So your two main folders are this config folder, and you don't even need to have these two files. You could literally just do a bunch of components in your pages folder, and they'd just be pages in your Gatsby. So it's a very flexible framework built on top of React. And the cool thing about it is that when you build, it takes all that data, pulls it at compile time, and statically puts it in the page. So basically when a person comes to view your website's not spending time gathering all this information because it's already plopped there statically, which makes your website faster and makes it better for like search engine results. It's a really cool framework. I'm a big fan of this. So that's the workflow of these three different types of frameworks. And hopefully you guys found this interesting. Thank you guys very much. Have a great day and enjoy. Oh, and make sure to head over to my website, alexmercedcoder.com. Okay, and make sure to sign up for my dev networking Slack. So here you can meet other developers, and also here you can go take a look at some of my applications that I have live online, and check out my LinkedIn, my YouTube, my podcast, all sorts of really cool stuff. So go check that out. But otherwise, have a great day and enjoy.